podcast giving young people a voice in politics across the island of Ireland. So today we're having a bit of a different episode. We're having a discussion about education with Daniel McCrossan of the SDLP and Robbie Butler of the UUP. So welcome to the show.
Very good to have. Thanks very much for having us.
So I suppose we'll get straight in. One of the big kind of issues at the moment, having been kind of massively changed by COVID, was academic selection. Now, your two parties have different positions on it. So I wanted to hear whether or not you think, following the kind of the whole breakdown of COVID with academic selection being cancelled in some schools, should we see a return to academic selection as normal whenever school can go back to normal? Or is it maybe time to scrap it or change the system? So start off with you, Dan.
Well, I've been quite vocal on this issue for most of the pandemic and prior. There's two separations here. One is the wider question about whether there should be a transfer test or not. And the other, specific to this year, was whether there should be one this year. And there'll be people that are pro-transfer test who will believe that there shouldn't be one this year. And there are people who are just totally against the transfer test and believe that the entire thing needs reviewed. I've looked at this in great detail. I've met with quite a lot of young people and discussed it, and with teachers and parents and principals as well. And I do believe now is the time for change. Now is the time for that system to be reformed. I believe it is a cruel system and certainly puts younger people under quite an immense amount of pressure at such a very young age. The other thing that concerns me most, and we've seen it play out throughout this pandemic, is the weight of pressure that is placed on young people and burdened on them, that this is where life starts and stops, which is quite concerning, given some of the language that is used by people in positions of leadership. Young people at the ages of 11 should not be expected to determine or be told that this test determines their future path. They are very young. Life is full of opportunities. Things can change in a sheer instant, and people can improve their circumstances quite quickly nowadays. I had very, very serious concerns about the agenda of the Minister for Education that played out in a very public way over the course of the last year. And I wasn't, prior to the pandemic, I wasn't proactively saying, let's trash the transfer test, let's get rid of it. But now, given what I have seen, given how I've seen the DUP play with this issue, given how I've seen total disregard for children and young people that attend other schools, all ability schools, I'm very concerned that this has created some form of a hierarchy in the education system, and that it has led to considerable questions over how appropriate it is or isn't. So with that said, my view is that yes, now is the time for reform of the transfer procedure. We've been told, and we've looked at this, and Robbie and I have had this debate at the Education Committee, what is there to replace it? What do we put in place? And in truth, and I've said this publicly, I struggle to see what the alternative could be. And that is where our focus needs to be. It's not that there is no alternative, it's just that there has been no viable alternative suggested or explored as of yet. And I think that's what we need to divert our attentions to. So before we can actually reform the current transfer procedure system, we need to look at what alternatives can be put in place that are fair, that don't put children under unnecessary pressure or add to issues with mental health. And we've seen that play out very, very publicly amongst families and parents actually worrying about how this test would affect their children's future if they didn't get to the school they wanted to get into, et cetera, et cetera. All unnecessary. I think that we need to look at this now for the sake of our young people, and I don't think the current transfer system is fit for purpose.
And what's your thoughts, Robbie? I know your party typically has a bit of a different position on it. So what are your thoughts?
Okay, I hope this doesn't freeze on you, because you guys are definitely freezing on me. So it was one of the things that disappointed me most in this whole sort of COVID pandemic and attitudes towards education here in Northern Ireland. There was no doubt that there was really serious difficulties with running the test, and for many reasons it was right that it didn't happen. It's on record that I did offer up what I believe to be a fair solution. We've got to understand, and we've got to be careful with our language when we're talking about young people fairness, equality, and pressures in mental health. And I mean, I'll debate with anybody on mental health and young people because I've been on that page since I became an MLA in 2016. Education brings pressure on, learning isn't easy. It's hard work. Young people will face tests throughout their lives. And I'm not going to disagree with Daniel to say that perhaps at age 11, it may not be the best time to do it. But here's the reality. We had a cohort of P7s last year who, from P1 right through to P7, knew what the pathway was. And that pathway was removed from them with nothing fair to replace it. Now, the offering that I had made was not perfect. But neither's the transfer test, and absolutely what happened wasn't perfect. Because, again, I'm not going to argue with Daniel on this point, it does create maybe mental health issues. It doesn't create mental health issues, but when it's not handled properly at age 11, when young or 10-year-olds that are doing the test find that pressure. But also, I mean, I've had, and Daniel will have also had, communications from parents and children whose mental health was affected because they didn't get to do the test that they had entered to do. Okay, so it was not a satisfactory outcome. What I believe needs to happen, Dermot, is that through the full review of education in Northern Ireland, that this isn't picked out in isolation. Because what has happened is it has become a real political topic for parents, for teachers, and so on to talk about. We do have a split in the sector. Do primary school principals and teachers want it? No, they don't, but they don't support it for a reason, which is that they don't want that pressure on themselves and on those pupils. However, we have to accept that the post-primary sector at the moment is constructed in such a way that that's what it kind of demands. What worryingly for me, what came about was when we looked at the evidence that primary schools are producing as to where their children are academically, they're vociferous in the fact that they'll say that's not a measurement of their educational ability. I think that was a revelation for parents this year, that that's not necessarily the page that our primary schools are on. And we need to be brave and create the environment where we can get primary school teachers and principals, grammar school teachers and principals, secondary school teachers and principals, all in an environment and say, well, what is better? And Daniel's point is absolutely right. I mean, nothing has been identified to replace it yet. I mean, from my background, until you've got a viable alternative, then you need to make the best of what you've got. And one thing that I do take issue with, and have talked about it, though, this is life defining. No, it's not life defining. If you tell somebody it's life defining, then it becomes life defining. But if you approach something in the right way and use the right language around it, then it is not self-fulfilling prophecy. Some of us were like a badge of honor where we didn't do the 11 plus, where we didn't pass it like me, and then you go on and you succeed. A lot of the discourse around the transfer test is deeply unhelpful, where it does become quite terminal for a lot of pupils. But what they soon realise when they go to either secondary school or grammar, they're going to get streamed anyway. You need to tell me of a secondary school where kids don't get streamed on day one. And already, so if you do away with the test and you go to a secondary school and say, well, we're going to stream you anyway, and we're going to kind of tell you where you are, that's kind of tough. So what I think needs to happen, Dermot, and I know Daniel will not disagree with this, we do need to have a discussion as to what is the best way for kids to transfer. But to do that, openly and honestly, we've got to determine what schools look like post-primary, and make sure that that's as fair and equitable as possible. Because one of the greatest unfairness issues this year was that if you went to a prep school, for many schools, that was the entry requirement number one. And as we know, if kids go to prep schools, predominantly they'll be from wealthy backgrounds, and this just compounds the academic unfairness that we already suffer from here. So I think we're up for a discussion, and we need to find a solution.
And one thing that I suppose I noticed with Minister Weir when it came to academic selection was he essentially insinuated that if you didn't go to a grammar school, you were missing out on opportunities. Now, I don't know, but to me that seems a bit kind of wrong. If one student is going to miss out on a lot more opportunities than the other because of a test they did when they were 11. So is his idea fair that you are missing out on a lot of opportunities, or is it more so just posturing? So what are your thoughts, Robbie?
I think that I'm sure that Daniel probably got Peter in the either on committee or in the chamber on that comment and probably didn't let him off. I think those were very careless words. I don't believe that he means it in his heart, and I think it was a clumsy way of maybe demonstrating that in some schools, for instance, maybe in sporting opportunities and things like that. I mean, to intimate that any exam, whether it's a transfer test or a GCSE or an A level, is terminal or fail, is words that should never come out of any minister's mouth or any politician's mouth. Lifelong learning is good, opportunities are good, and we need to equip, whether that's financially or whether it's through policy and procedures, every school to be a good school and to give parents and pupils the confidence to know that whichever school they go to, they will get the opportunities that they deserve.
And what are your thoughts, Daniel?
Yeah, well, Robbie's right. I took great offence to that statement. And, you know, in hindsight, when I look at it, I probably think he didn't mean it as it sounded or as he wrote it, but he did put it out there, and it did cause a lot of alarm and concern. It was careless and clumsy of a Minister for Education to put such a statement out. And like I reminded Peter Weir that he is not just the Minister for grammar schools, he is the Minister for each and every one of our children in education across Northern Ireland, and he needs to be reminded of that constantly. I do have a concern about the level of language being used by the DUP on this subject. It has been entirely politicised, and it has caused a huge amount of upset and annoyance. To say to any child, and we have to remember, children at a young age have no control over their own circumstances. They all live in very different circumstances. Some come from very impoverished backgrounds, socially deprived areas, and there's all ranges of circumstances that could affect their ability or their opportunities to develop at the same pace as someone would have all those supports around them. But that should not affect their opportunities long term. The system has a responsibility. The Minister of Education has a responsibility to ensure that all children have access to educational opportunities that are fair to every single child and young person. That statement did the opposite of that. That basically, and that's my earlier point, that basically created a hierarchy within the education system, that those that go to grammar schools will have access to much better opportunities than those that go to all ability schools, which is entirely inaccurate. I went to an all ability school. I've had very good opportunities in life. I'm very fortunate to have the position as West Tyrone MLA, and I'm honoured to serve people here in the community that I'm from. And I didn't need the 11 plus. I didn't need to be put under that pressure to do that. I went on, did my GCSEs, did my A levels, went to university, did a degree in law, started a PhD. You know, there's endless opportunities for people, and that is why it really worries me to send a message out to young people at 11 years of age that you need to do this, or else your opportunities in the future will be affected. And we have to remember, in a world with social media, people are so easily influenced and are worried. So if you, particularly young people, you know, everybody wants to do their best. Everybody wants to have access to good opportunities, to have a good job, to have good housing and all the rest. And from an early age now, that has been drilled into young people. Why do we not just let young people be young people, enjoy life and enjoy the innocence of that at such a young age, instead of putting such huge pressure on them? Because as a result of that pressure, those who don't make it through this rigorous system then feel that they have failed. But the actual reality is that they've been failed by a system that is not fit for purpose. And that's really where we need to focus the argument, and that's where this is most concerning. But the language needs to be tidied up. Words matter. In Northern Ireland, people take it seriously. Young people are hanging on to every word. I've never seen so many young people engaged with the political system as I have throughout this pandemic, because they've realised it's had a direct impact on them and on their lives.
And another big issue at the moment is the exam situation. Now, to be honest, personally, I've found it to be a bit of a fiasco, because I went from having only really 2 exams per subject. Now I've got 4. So I've essentially had my exams doubled. So has the minister been effective in dealing with the exam situation, and has he actually done it properly? So I'll start off with you, Daniel.
I've been very critical of Peter, and I'm mindful that Peter is in a difficult situation. There's no blueprint for this pandemic. There's no book that he can refer to that has all the answers. He has to respond and react. But he also has a choice. He could show leadership. He could put the interests of young people, teachers, and schools first. And at all instances throughout this pandemic, in all aspects of education, he hasn't done that. He has waited to see what England is going to do, what the Secretary for Education there is going to do first, and then followed very quickly, even though teachers, principals, parents, young people, fellow politicians, even within his own party, were warning him that he needed to do something quite urgently, that the path at the earliest stage of the examination process, when we warned young people were going to be left in tears, that they're going to be badly affected, that it's going to leave people not able, missing out in university places, all sorts of things. Completely ignored it. But the second that the Secretary for Education in England moved, he moved. That's not what people want from their education minister here in Northern Ireland. We have a responsibility for the people we represent here, not looking at what's going on in the south of Ireland or in England, Scotland or Wales. We should be leading from the front. This place could be very, very effective and could do very well if ministers would show leadership. And unfortunately, throughout this entire pandemic, Peter has been probably too careful and afraid to go to the front and show leadership for young people. And I think that is what has fed a lot of the anxiety, a lot of the frustration. That is what has led to the claims by so many parents that their children have mental health has been affected. It's because there's been so much uncertainty and no leadership. And the exams is the exact example of that. Peter could have led from the start. We've made that clear to him. We've recalled the Assembly on this issue. That's how strong we felt on it, because we've seen the impact it's had. And I do believe that he has got this wrong. And as a consequence now, a year into this pandemic, we still haven't found a solution to this problem, because exactly what you've said, Dermot, where exams have doubled, particularly for young people doing GCSE. The measurable pressure on young people doing GCSE in more normal times is huge. But now with this pandemic, they're being burdened with extra assessments. And the reason behind that is because of the system that SIA and the Minister for Education, Department of Education, have agreed as the appropriate way forward, where they've created a table, a scale that requires X amount of evidence to justify a grade, which leaves a principal in a very uncertain situation where the only way he can get adequate evidence, in his opinion, is by examination. And I've questioned the minister in this, I've questioned Justin Edwards in this from SIA, and they've both told me, no, that's not what we want. But unfortunately, in the report that they put out, that's exactly what is happening. And principals are telling me that they've been left with very little choice because of how the instructions came to them. Now, I've sought clarification on it. The minister has provided that reassurance to me, but unfortunately on paper it's saying a very different thing. And this is where the mixed messaging and the uncertainty comes about, because no principal, no teacher wants to be accused of not properly following the guidance that is there, and certainly leaving themselves wide open to being challenged by parents, if you like. So that's why they've gone for this, the strongest possible evidential base, which unfortunately is examination. It's entirely wrong. We're in a pandemic. There's no answers to any of these questions, and we need to put the interests of young people first. Everybody has gone through this, and there's been continuous talk of an equal, a level playing field. There is no level playing field in this pandemic, because people are in different circumstances. But what is the same is that children have lost out on huge educational opportunities. Some will benefit from that at home because of the circumstances of their parents being able to afford tutors or so on and so forth. But others who live in a house with 4 siblings, 1 electronic device, if even, at home, and no real support, then that's far from the level playing field. And this is what worries me about these exams, because I think children from more disadvantaged backgrounds are going to pay the ultimate price for this pandemic, which is what I am totally against. I'm sure Robbie and many others would say the same.
And what are your thoughts, Robbie? I know that both of your parties have been very vocal, and you both have been very vocal in the Education Committee on the kind of the exam fiasco, and as I continue to call it, because that's really what it is. So what have your thoughts been?
Yeah, so it is a fiasco, Dermot, in many ways. So one of the other things that has happened consistently throughout this COVID is the date and time so that information is shared, whether it's from CCA, whether it's from the department, that's from EA, with principals and school teachers. And usually it's on a Friday evening, about 7 o'clock. Sometimes it's just before a holiday kicks in, and the timing of the dissemination of information hasn't been useful. I think it plays into what Daniel has said, is that so there's kind of like a lack of confidence in the leadership from the minister. And I haven't been critical of the minister too much, because I've never been a minister. I don't know what it takes to be a minister, and there inevitably will be difficulties in there. But there are certain things you can do in a leadership style to give confidence. And one of those was, I believe there was a lack of consultation previously and open and transparent discussions, which I think should almost happen in the public forum with regard to issues like we're talking about at the moment. Now, with regard to the exams, it's a really kind of perverse sort of situation we find ourselves in. What we're going to be inevitably doing post these tests and assessments is looking and saying, was last year's solution better? And you look at the debacle and the arguments and the haranguing that we did around the system, and then the ill-fated algorithm. Now, it would never have been muted that was a possibility. The algorithm would never have made it, but we may be looking at this post these assessments and saying, well, actually what we should have done was the same as last year. Now, I think it's a little bit more complex as to why it's got to where it is. Because I do know that CCA had teachers from each specialism in their consultation process to create what they did in consultation with Ofqual and the other examination bodies. But Daniel touched on one of the issues and problems, and we need to talk about everything that's in the room here, guys. Pupils across Northern Ireland in this year did not get access to the same level of support, whether that was through and Daniel's picked out one, which is the online and digital poverty, whether in their circumstance they maybe either have the right device or they don't, or they're sharing it. And also schools, to be fair, have an enormous amount of autonomy to teach. So I've got instances and examples of in the same town where two schools have taken a different approach to online learning. We're in the same school, teachers across different subjects have taken a different approach to online learning and so on. And let me say this, I'm not blaming them. What I'm saying is each school and principal took what they thought to be the best course of action throughout this year. Had there been a uniformity in terms of what was expected, then perhaps we wouldn't see the inequality that we're going to see. Because Dermot, you've said you're going from 2 assessments per subject to 4. I have got some young people that have been contacting me who are facing upwards of 40 assessments. I've got some that are faced with 10. Now that can't be fair. And the reasons are not just subject choices, but actually they're different schools. And different schools have maybe more confidence to lean on teacher assessments through evidence. But if that evidence doesn't exist, the only other alternative, unfortunately, is assessment. So what I'm concerned about is the inequity for students at this time. There's no doubt that stress exists around exams. There's plenty of academic studies and reports. That will always be the case, but it's been exacerbated. And if you are not being treated the same as someone else, but you genuinely have tried your hardest and through no fault of your own, you don't have that evidence base, because whether it's digital poverty or whatever, that's not going to be taken into consideration by my estimation. Daniel's quite right in terms of communications with the Minister and CCEA when they drew this up. I do believe them, by the way. I do believe what they're saying when they did not expect schools to have to supply evidence through assessments in such the manner that's happening. But what they probably didn't know is that schools didn't have the levels of evidence that were required for what they were setting up. So it seems to be a disconnect in the conversation and constructing it. Had they have had the information to say that maybe some of this evidence doesn't exist, there should have been more of a reliance on teacher predicted grades in that instance. And I think this cohort of pupils deserved every bit of support that last year's cohort of pupils got. And we're back to Education Committee next week, and you can bet your bottom dollar that myself and my friend Daniel will be very vocal on this.
So another final issue I want to look at as well is integrated education. Now, there is continued work done by various organisations. I know we've seen some of the first ever conversions of different schools. So is there enough integrated education? Should there be more? And can you see more coming in the future? So start off with you, Robbie.
Yeah, sure. I think whether it's called integrated education, shared education, or single education system, which would be the Ulster Unionist Party's offering, if you like, there are a number of things that we have to be very aware of. If you define integrated education as children from whatever background being educated together, you have to say absolutely 100%. We should not have segregated education. We should not. And I don't think any politician come on here and advocate for segregated education. But what we have to be brave about is saying what actually can across Northern Ireland, particularly at the minute. Not sure when this podcast will go out, but there's been rioting in all areas. You've got communities that never mix. You've got young people that evidently just still have some sort of bitterness there for whatever, mostly stuff that they probably don't quite understand when they're seeking to attack another community or somebody else. That some form of integrated education could deal with a lot of those problems. But here's where the rubber hits the road. We still very much live in a segregated society. So what needs to be factored in is that a lot of schools exist in these communities. So if you live, for instance, in West or North Belfast, and your community is 100% Catholic or 100% Protestant, and the school is in that area, what does it mean? Does it mean that you force children from another community to come into that school and occupy the space and to drive past sometimes 3 or 4 schools to get there for the purpose of? And what I'm very interested in at the minute actually is exploring technology and exploring different ways to learn, because we're brought up on the staple diet of you need 30 children in a classroom, sitting at a desk, teacher up the front, and everybody pays attention and this is how you learn. But is that necessarily the best way to learn in 2021 and as we look forward? We do have an aged infrastructure around schools, and we live in these kind of little bubbles. So what do? If we can't actually bus and force people to go to certain schools, can we do it in another way? Should we utilize technology? Should we be having virtual teachers? Should we have children being taught kind of with a teacher but a big whiteboard, sharing virtual classrooms in virtual lessons? Is that a modern, novel way of saying this is how we do integrated, shared or single education systems? And I think we need to be looking outside the box. Stop trying to get children and move them physically to here and thinking that does it. There could be much more efficient, modern ways of teaching and ways of achieving that. The other thing that we have to talk about too is not only our schools still segregated, but so are our teacher training colleges, and that's down to the FIDO, which is shouldn't be there. There should be no allowance for a discrimination with regard to how teachers gain their qualifications, and there should be no barrier whether you're a Protestant or Catholic to teach in a school at the moment, regardless of what the ethos of that school is. And I think that's something that the Assembly will look at. And it's kind of perverse when you think if we're living segregated lives, we're educated in segregated manner, and our teachers are trained in a segregated manner to an extent. We're perpetuating something which is unhealthy for Northern Ireland, regardless of what your political or constitutional position is. I think educating together is an absolute key to healing in this country, which evidently can be seen. It's not too hard to lift a layer of the onion off and see that things aren't just as good as maybe we thought.
I think that's definitely, there's quite a lot there, but I think the idea of a virtual kind of integrated education is something I'd never heard of before, and it's something I'd never actually thought of, but it's definitely interesting. But Daniel, what's your thoughts on integrated education? Have we got enough, or should there be more? And what's the future for integrated education?
Well, we're 23 years on from the Good Friday Agreement, and our society, regardless of the scenes in Belfast and throughout Northern Ireland, our society has moved on. People don't want that happening. People have there's integration in many aspects of life in Northern Ireland in terms of housing and people attending local schools, natural integration of people from various backgrounds. And we have to be mindful as well that we just don't have the Catholic population or the Protestant population. Now we have many others as well. And there is a natural form of integration happening right across Northern Ireland. Is it where it should be? No. What is the reason for that? When you have political leaders sitting at Stormont in a 5-party coalition and the two leading the government can't sit down together, can't agree, can't stand on a podium, and can't integrate in government, how on earth can that happen at a grassroots level in our schools and in our society, in communities? We still have peace walls in Northern Ireland. And I often ask myself, I watched the footage over the last few days, and I asked that if the SDLP was in government with, say, the Ulster Unionists, would those peace walls still be there? I don't think so. I think there has been a failure by the leadership in Northern Ireland of the two larger parties, who deliberately poke each other in the eye 12 months from an election to stoke up tension, to call each other all the names of the day, to distract from the fact that they're actually delivering nothing at all to better the lives of our citizens or our people out there, which is what people want, and instead do whatever it takes to keep each other in government by saying, you know, if you don't vote for us, you're going to get them. The reality is, by voting for either of them, you get them anyway. And our society needs to look beyond all that now. You've seen the calls for the condemnation of what has happened right across, and you've seen how young people have been pushed into violence and thuggery and everything else. And you scratch the surface of that and you look what's behind that. And what's behind that is control in communities. It's happening in Derry, it's happening in Belfast, it's happening in a lot of places that we don't even know about. Again, that comes back to failed leadership. It comes back to the fact that we have not had proper reconciliation here. We've simply forced people into a room for the sake of it, and actually have delivered very little meaningful relationship building on the ground throughout our community. So with that said, if we can't get the most simple things right, if political leaders can't stand together on a podium during a pandemic, during the biggest threat to our society that we've seen in many, many years, during the challenges of Brexit, then what hope is there for them to try and bring about a greater integrated society in every aspect, be it in the community, be it in education, or so on and so forth? They can't get it right. And I do believe that our young people out there, from whatever background they're from, are now starting to see the bigger picture, because they don't want to be a part of that any longer. They don't want their children to be a part of that. I would class Robbie and I as the younger members of the assembly. And then Robbie reminded me of his age one day. But when we look at that assembly, we want that assembly to work. We want to build relationships. We want to find the common ground across this place to make it workable, for a simple reason, so that young people can benefit from the peace, so that young people can build a future for themselves, so that young people can walk down the street side by side with each other and not worrying if Annie or Mary or David or Stephen is a Catholic or a Protestant or other, that they're friends because they are friends, not apart because of religion. Like identity, as Hume often said, is an accident of birth. No one can help that. The reality is we have so much in common with each other that it can't even be seen. So back to my point, in Strabane, in West Tyrone, I've seen levels of integration that have happened naturally because society is well ahead of some political leaders in this country. And that's the reality, well ahead. And parents are well ahead as well. I was sent to the local school, not because it was a state school or a controlled school or anything like that. It was because it was the local school. And from a very young age, I enjoyed what I would describe as natural integration without labels, where I was in a classroom with 30 others maybe, and I didn't know, nor did I care if they were Catholic, Protestant or other. And throughout my entire life, that is how I've lived, and that's how how I've been shaped. Because my parents made a decision that you're going to the local school, and David Canning was the principal. He does a huge amount of work for me on education nowadays, and is hugely helpful in a lot of things. Shares the same view as I do on this. We need to get away from labels and focus on what is happening naturally. But in order for society to truly integrate, the people that are elected at the top, the leaders of this place, need to start showing some leadership and need to start working together. Because if they're apart, society sees that, society stays apart.
Absolutely. I think at the minute, you know, we've become so polarized, and as a result, it's been reflected in education. But I think we will leave it there. I know we've probably went on for a while, so thank you both for coming on. For everyone listening, thank you all for listening. You can obviously catch us on our social medias at YouthVoiceNI on Twitter and at YouthVoice_NI on Instagram, or you can read our blog, www.youthvoiceni.com, where You can read a couple of articles about integrated education, about academic selection and constitutional change, period poverty, quite literally anything you can think of. We have it up there. So give it a read, listen to our other episodes. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you all